I warmly welcome you to yet another conversation under the India at 100 series, which is the flagship program of the Indian Society for Universal Dialogue. And we are collaborating with the Equals Project to come up with this conversation on the Constituent Assembly. Today's program is quite significant in at least two ways, if not more. The first being the fact that we have now successfully completed 75 years of having been a constitutional democracy, which is an achievement given the economic and political circumstances that have recently unfolded in our neighborhood. For example, with Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Burma, and Sri Lanka. So the question arises as to how have we managed to so far steer clear of any kind of constitutional crisis. So this is one of the things that we will be discussing with some reflections as to the discussions that took place in the Constituent Assembly. The second reason why today's program is significant is because we are joined by some of the direct descendants of the members of the Constituent Assembly who will be sharing with us some personal anecdotes of the life and times of the magnificent men and women who sat in conclave to decide the future of India. We have with us this evening Ambassador Latha Reddy, who has flown in from Bangalore this morning. She had joined the Indian Foreign Service in the year 1975, having spent a career over 36 years as a diplomat, serving as Indian ambassador to Portugal and Thailand, and she was Secretary East in the Ministry of External Affairs before retiring, and was later appointed as the Deputy National Security Advisor of India between 2011 and 2013. Ambassador Latha Reddy happens to be the granddaughter of H.C. Guru Reddy and the grandniece of Mr. K.C. Reddy, both of whom were members of the Constituent Assembly from Mysore state. And Mr. K.C. Reddy was instrumental in making Mysore an independent state, and he went on to become the first Chief Minister of Mysore. We're also honored to have with us this evening Mr. Raju Ramachandran, who has flown in from Delhi for this event. He is a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India with almost 50 years of experience in the bar. He is also a constitutional expert, among many other things, and served as the additional Solicitor General of India under Soli Sorabji, who was then the Attorney General. On a rather interesting note, Mr. Ramachandran also happens to be indirectly linked to two of the members of the Constituent Assembly, about whom I think he will reveal in due course of the conversation. That brings me to Mrs. Geeta Doctor, who I think is on her way. She must be on her way, okay. She's a senior journalist who is renowned for her work in the field of journalism, having contributed fascinating columns and articles in various magazines and newspapers like The Hindu, The Indian Express, The Times of India, Frontline, Scroll, etc. I would like to add that she happens to be the daughter of Mr. K.V. Padmanabhan, who was at that point of time a distinguished lawyer from Madras until he made it to New Delhi in 1946, and he was asked to be an undersecretary in the Constituent Assembly Secretariat, assisting none other than Sir B.N. Rao in preparing the first draft of the Constitution, after which in 1949 he joined the Indian Foreign Service and served the Ministry of External Affairs for 2 decades. He also served as India's High Commissioner to Pakistan, among many other diplomatic posts. That brings me to Mr. Manuraj Shanmugasundaram, senior advocate, soon to be senior advocate at the High Court of Madras, a prominent member of the Madras Bar. He has a strong practice in London as well as in Chennai, and he's the founding partner of Manuraj and Ganesan LLP. He's known for handling complex constitutional and criminal matters, and is known for his writ petition of Shushma versus Commissioner of Police, which is now a landmark judgment of the Madras High Court delivered by Justice N. Anand Venkatesh. Mr. Manuraj is also a regular columnist at The Hindu, which includes his editorial that was published just this morning, titled Foundational Values, Journey of the Indian State, which I urge all of you to give a read. To moderate this discussion, we have with us Mrs. Shruti Vishwanathan, founder of the Equals Project, which is a research and teaching organization that seeks to explore India's founding moment. She is a lawyer and policy professional with 13 years of experience. She also is a graduate from National Law School, Bangalore, and holds a master's degree from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Massachusetts. We also have some eminent guests who have joined us among the audience. I thank you all for joining us, members of the ISUD, students, ladies and gentlemen, friends from the media. Without any further delay, I think we can begin with the conversation. I request Shruti to take over the rostrum. Thank you.
As we go along. So thank you, Aswin, first of all, for that wonderful introduction. I don't need to reintroduce our guests and their illustrious service here. But like Aswin mentioned, we are very, very lucky today to have with us individuals who have connections directly to the Constituent Assembly. And we thought we'll start off by asking them about their personal anecdotes and stories around the Constituent Assembly. I'll start off with Ambassador Latha Reddy, who has both a grand-uncle and a grandfather in the Assembly. And like Aswin mentioned, we are doubly lucky because she was also great friends with Shyam Benegal, who shot Samvidhaan, that series there. So ma'am, even if you have any reflections from Mr. Benegal's life that you'd like to share here.
From Jawaharlal Nehru and Feroz Gandhi, my grandfather and his son-in-law, K.C. Reddy, were the only other combination of a father-in-law, son-in-law in the Constituent Assembly. So I thought that's an interesting factoid I could share with you all. And, you know, I was very fortunate to grow up in a household which was completely imbued with the spirit of the Constitution, because between my grandfather and my uncle, we were taught to truly respect what the freedom fighters created in the Constitution. And, you know, we grew up on a diet of constituent issues. We grew up on a diet of what is democracy, and so on and so forth. So I think I was personally very, very lucky to be born into this family. And I consider it a great honor to have been descended from people like Mr. Guruvar Reddy and K.C. Reddy. And K.C. Reddy, as you all know, became the first Chief Minister of Karnataka. He is the one who laid the foundation for the Vidhan Sauda. And my grandfather had a very interesting life. He was the first in his family to become a graduate. Like many of us, you know, he came from an agricultural background. And he was truly the first to venture out of the village and, you know, progress beyond secondary school training. And he did his law degree in Bombay High Court. And he was actually a member of the Prajapaksha party, as was my uncle. And the Prajapaksha party was more devoted to the cause of bringing up the backward classes, the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, and so on. And he was very passionate about this. But eventually they merged with the Mysore Congress. And they then dedicated themselves to the task of gaining independence for Mysore state and for India on the whole. And my grandfather was a dedicated Gandhian, and he wore khadi all his life. He never wore any Western clothes at all. And my uncle as well became a fervent Gandhian after he left the Prajapaksha party and merged with the Mysore Congress. You know, as I said, I'm very fortunate to have been born into this family. But I have many anecdotes, I have many stories to share, but I don't know whether this is the right time to do it or... Yes, I should? Okay. Well, one of them is that my grandfather was actually in the room in the hostel that was allocated to the out-of-town members in the Constituent Assembly, next to Mr. Annadore of Chennai. And so Mr. Annadore used to often come over to my grandfather's room because my grandmother had accompanied my grandfather. They had married quite young. And he loved to eat home-cooked food. But he said he had great difficulty with ragi mudde. You know? because that's really quite difficult to eat. But he loved her Vonchan Charu, you know.
I thought you were going to say he had great difficulty with the sambar, because that is a point of contention.
No. I think he was quite all right with our sambar. But the difficulty was with the ragi mudde, because that is really an art, you know, rolling it around in the gravy and swallowing it. And he was so elated when he found out from my father, who was in the IAS, that he was related to both Gura Reddy and KC Reddy. When my father was posted in the Surgical Instruments Project in Chennai from 61 to 68. And he immediately got up and embraced him. And he was so happy, and he recollected all these old stories, which is what my father has recorded in his own words. And so, you know, that was one interesting episode. And the other was, my grandfather was, you know, explained to me that he said we had to make certain compromises, whether it was on the Uniform Civil Code, whether it was on the language question, because if we hadn't done that, there would have been no unanimity in passing the Constitution. And so we had to make certain compromises. He was, of course, a fierce opponent of Hindi being the national language. And the funny thing was, later on in my service, when I became the officer who was in charge of the propagation of Hindi, I said the poor man would be horrified if he knew this. You know. But, you know, these are the vicissitudes of government service. You have to do the job that's given to you. And it came along with my portfolio, so I had no choice. But I'll stop here and give the others a chance to also come in with their comments, and maybe some of the other issues I can raise later.
Sure, ma'am. And would you like to say anything about Shyam Benegal?
Yes. Losing Shyam, I think, has been a very difficult thing for all of us who admire and loved him. He was a great filmmaker, as you would have seen from the brief condensed version of Samvidhaan. Incidentally, I've seen all the 10 episodes, and they are outstanding. They were shown at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Bangalore. And I never missed a single one of them. And I don't know what you all recognize, but it was Swara Bhaskar who was doing the narration. And I must congratulate you all on having created the subtitles, because I think it would have been easier for some people to follow because it's in Hindi. In fact, I'm wondering why it's never been dubbed into English, or is there an English version?
It's not been dubbed, but the full 10 episodes have English subtitles for all the Hindi
but
bits,
not the
condensed
version. I see. So anyway, the fact of the matter is that Shyam was immensely talented. Whichever films he made, whether it was his earlier work of Ankur, Nishant and so on, which really became messengers of social change for my generation, or whether it was his later works, and he really did some amazing work on outstanding Muslim women, such as I think there was Zubaida, there was Mammo, and there was a third one, I remember, I think a Begum, or some Begum. Anyway, the fact of the matter is that Shyam Benegal treated every project in a different way, whether it was his last film, which was on Mujibur Rahman in Bangladesh, or whether it was, you know, as I said, this trilogy of films on women, or it was, each one was a labor of love. And I, for one, have lost a friend, a very dear friend, and he and I worked together on the making of the Mahatma, the film in South Africa, because I was Consul General in Durban at that time. And, you know, I really feel the world is a a poorer place for being without a talent like Shyam Benegal. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Mama is such a fantastic movie because the very human cost of partition that comes out in that movie is great. And I don't think it's as well known as some of his other work. I find, K.C. Reddy's story particularly interesting because often we don't reflect on as much as while the independence movement was seeking freedom from the British, there was equally a movement to seek freedom from the Rajas and the other, the royalty that existed in various parts of India. And I want to talk about a quick story about someone after whom a very prominent road in Chennai is named, C.P. Ramaswamy Road, which is just a few kilometers from here. And C.P. Ramaswamy was the Diwan of Travancore at the time and a very well-respected, illustrious man. And when independence for India became real, CP and Travancore wanted to become independent on their own. And all the other Rajas wanted to shoot from the shoulder of CP because he was so well respected, had done a lot of great things in Travancore. And they thought that if CP can become independent and if Travancore can become independent, so can we. But the Travancore Congress itself was aghast at this, right? Because they didn't want to be under a Raja. They had fought so hard for democracy. So in a very South Indian way, CP was attending a concert and then he gets shot by someone in there. And then this really shocks CP, right? Like he didn't expect an assassination attempt. And pretty soon after, Travancore and CP sign over the accession instrument. And after that, all the other Rajas see the writing on the wall and decide that pursuing independence, except for a few like the Nizam of Hyderabad, is not a viable path. So I think K.C. Reddy's example is particularly interesting because it's not just an independent India, but what does an independent state of Mysore look like within it? I will now hand over the mic to Mr. Raju Ramachandran. I won't spoil it, but I'll let him talk about his connection to the Constituent Assembly.
Good evening. Thank you. I think my turn has come a little earlier than it should have, only because Ms. Geeta Doctor has not yet joined. Because just as Latha ma'am is a direct descendant of members of the Constituent Assembly, Ms. Geeta Doctor is the daughter of a distinguished civil servant, someone who worked with Sir B.N. Rao, and so she can also claim a direct connection. My connection, and that's why I was a little diffident about Aswin announcing the nature of my connection. My connection is that of a name dropper, a wannabe, because I claim connection to two members so diverse in their backgrounds, one being Begum Qudsiya Aizaz Rasool from the United Provinces, later Uttar Pradesh, and the other to Sir Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer. Now, how am I connected to these two people? Begum Aizaz Rasool's granddaughter is one of my oldest and dearest friends, Taimina Punwani, who is also a senior advocate. And Sir Alladi Krishnaswamy, I claim a connection because he has two great grandnephews who are practicing lawyers. One worked as my junior in Delhi, Mamidipudi Mukunda, and there is a lawyer here who has been invited for this function. I don't know whether he's been able to reach or not. He is Mamidipudi Swaroop, who is not just a rising lawyer, but a great flautist. And because Mukunda is my junior, so that's my connection. And one of my cherished pictures, which I shared with a few of the panelists, is this constituent picture where Taimina is on my right side and Mukunda is on my left side. But these two names being spoken about together, there is some significance also, apart from this mere coincidence. Look at their two different backgrounds. One is a Muslim woman, one of the few Muslim women in the Constituent Assembly, from a privileged background. She was a descendant of the princely family of Malerkotla in Punjab, which is the only Muslim majority district today in India. But she had the best of schooling in Queen Mary's School, Lahore, Kinnaird College, Lahore. But then she was married into a Talukdar's family in Awadh, so moved to Lucknow, where in the ancestral village of Sandila, Parda was practiced. Otherwise, she was not accustomed to Parda. So she struck a compromise that when she went to the ancestral village of her husband, she would observe the custom of Parda. But in her Karma Bhumi, which was Lucknow, she wouldn't. And so she was a member of the Muslim League initially. She was a member of the UP Legislative Council and leader of the opposition there, while simultaneously being a member of the Constituent Assembly. Please also remember that many members of the Constituent Assembly were multitasking. They continued to be members of their provincial legislatures. They worked in the Constituent Assembly in the morning, and that same assembly became the Constituent Assembly Legislative in the afternoon to pass ordinary laws. So, while doing some research, I found something very interesting. One is, of course, the quaint use of the expression 8 of the clock as against 8 o'clock, because that's how it was originally. So the proceedings say the Constituent Assembly met at 8 of the clock on 30th May 1949. Now there could be two reasons for this. One is the hot Delhi summer. And so even today, many courts in northern India during the hot summer months have something called morning courts. So the courts start, even the high courts, start at 7:30 in the morning and go on till 1. So hot summer is one reason. But the other possible reason is that they had to do ordinary legislative work also. So see how hard they worked. And Begum Aizaz Rasool in between would find time to go to attend to her duties in the UP Legislative Council as well. And she was a very emancipated woman of her times. She was also president later of the Indian Women's Hockey Federation and Asian Women's Hockey Federation. So her autobiography is called From Parda to Parliament. A second edition is going to be out soon, published by Roli Books. And I have been very much in the loop about the bringing out of the second edition of the book. So I can claim some familiarity with her life and work. Another interesting nugget about this 8 of the clock is, and this is a young lawyer friend who pointed it out in response to a post which I had put, 8 a.m. on a summer afternoon. My young friend pointed out another page from the debates where one member protests saying, today the House has met at 12 minutes past 8. We are 12 minutes late. How will we get along with our work if we are unpunctual? So that was the dedication of the members of the Constituent Assembly. Now, Begum Aizaz Rasool records in her memoirs that all the Muslim members were greatly embarrassed when one Chaudhry Khaliquzzaman, who was a prominent member of the Muslim League, though formally the Muslim League had decided to boycott the Constituent Assembly. He purportedly went to Pakistan on a personal visit, but didn't return. He had just defected to Pakistan. And this hugely, apparently, embarrassed the Muslim members of the assembly. And in due course, the Muslim League decided to dissolve itself. It exists as a political party only in Kerala. Muslim League, with its connotations of partitions, etc., doesn't exist as a party, and it was in this context. And Begum Azaz Rasool later joined the Congress, held positions as a minister in Uttar Pradesh, became a member of the Lok Sabha, and was honored with the Padma Bhushan by the Vajpayee government, a long and distinguished record of public service. Sir Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer is from the city of Chennai, and Manuraj and I, as lawyers, I suppose we revere him in a different way. But there is a difference in social backgrounds. Now, while Begum Azaz Rasool came from a princely family and then was married into a zamindari family, Sir Alladi was the son of an ordinary priest, an ordinary purohit. The family faced dire economic circumstances. By dint of hard work, he rose. He studied history in the Madras Christian College and became a tutor there, and was known for his lectures both on Roman history and in Indian history. Studied law on the side, and within 7 years of joining the bar, became a leading member of the Madras Bar. And no greater tribute could be paid to Sir Alladi than what Chief Justice Rajamannar of Madras High Court said of Alladi. He said, when we argue at our best, we must compare ourselves with Alladi at his worst. So I put this as a post recently saying, all of us who consider ourselves to be the prima donnas of the bar need to be brought down to terra firma, because this is what was said of Sir Alladi. But then someone coming from such a background, a self-made man, rising to such heights and contributing so significantly to the proceedings of the Constituent Assembly, because in every major issue, you will find the contribution of Sir Alladi. And Dr. Ambedkar has said somewhere in the debates that he believed that actually it should have been Alladi who should have been the chair of the drafting committee. That was a tribute paid by Dr. Ambedkar. And Alladi was part of as many as 9 committees in the Constituent Assembly. And apart from this, what I want to emphasize in conclusion before our next speaker, I think Ms. Geeta Doctor is here, is to say that the Constituent Assembly was an unrepresentative body if we go by the numbers who elected them, because it was an indirectly elected body. Those from British India were elected from the provincial legislatures. Those from princely states were nominated. And those who were elected by the provincial legislatures also, remember that at that time, the electorate to the provincial legislatures was not more than 28.5% of the adult population, because there were restrictions on the basis of education, on the basis of taxation, on the basis of property. And so this was the unrepresentative character of the assembly at one level. But on the other hand, the assembly had such a myriad of the sections of Indian societies, different shades of opinion, different strata of society, and that is why, in spite of this artificial creation, they have given us a constitution which is now 75 years old, which we celebrate, and rightly so. We swear by its basic structure. Who gave us this basic structure? An indirectly elected body, but which still represented a cross-section of Indian opinion. Thank you.
Delighted to be here with so many prima donnas of the legal profession, even if they're not as good as the famous Aladi Ramakrishnan. Absolutely delighted. I have to say I'm here as an imposter because I have nothing to do with the evening to all of you also. I'm here mostly on behalf of my father, K.V. Padmanabhan, who was the Undersecretary at the Commissariat of the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly. And I would not have known anything about him because when all this was happening, I was about 3 years old. So my knowledge is entirely incidental. And due to this wonderful scholar called Ordit Shani, a person with attached to Tel Aviv University, who came and unearthed everything that she could find about the actual people and the working of how this happened, how India became democratic. And it's only through her knowledge that I was able to unearth something of what my father had done in those just before partition. I also remember that after he retired, we used to live on Harrington Road, which, if anyone knows Madras, gets flooded every year. Now, he had, after his retirement, done a 5-volume record of the making of the Constitution with Mr. Shiva Rao as the editor. And these books would be kept on a bookshelf in my mother's house. And we thought, well, that's the Indian Constitution. Because every time the rain started, my mother would say, please save the Indian Constitution. And we really thought that, well, yes, we should save it. I'm here mostly to say that what my father did was very interesting, and I will show you 2 photographs. This is my father's photograph, K.V. Padmanabhan. And about 1 month back, I received a photograph, sorry. This gentleman. Now, this person's name is totally unknown to me. His name is Mr. Natesha Iyer. And apparently, yeah, you can just remove it. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. So, I had a message from this Mr. Natesha Iyer's grandson saying that while he was going through his grandfather's papers, he found a letter addressed to Mr. Natesha Iyer by K.V. Padmanabhan, thanking him for his question about how they were going about creating this document that we now know as the Constitution. So my father's main task was to read all these really thousands and thousands of letters which poured in from all over the country. And, you know, when people say that the Constitution is done by a small group of very elite people, I think that's a very erroneous idea. And we should realize that elite or otherwise, this group of people really kind of believe that they should involve the people, which is why the most significant part of that Constitution, in my opinion, is we the people. And my father's duty was to actually check through these numerous letters, associations, different kinds of views, and everything that we hear today, the minority saying, but the Jain said, why aren't we here? And even if Mr. Natesh Iyer, who I was told was a very, very cosmopolitan person who believed in the education of women, and his question was, what will happen to Madras when the Madras presidency is dissolved and it breaks up into the other states? So forming of these states, the different states, was a very important part of the deliberations. So the other person who was very, very significant in my father's life was V.P. Menon. As you know, he was the gentleman who persuaded all the princes to give up their hereditary rights to become a part of the Indian Union, even though two of them, as you know, Hyderabad and Kashmir, did not do so and had to be kind of coerced. And that problem of Kashmir continues, as we all recognize and understand. The other thing I would like to say is there is very much of a Madras connection to this constitutional process. And that is because in 1913, there was a conference of Association of Indian Women, started by, mostly by, there were people like Amu Swaminathan and the Theosophists, cousins, I forget her name right now, Mary Klabwala, and they were the core group of women of South Indian extraction. And you mentioned some Muslim ladies, they were also there, Lady Rama Rao and so on. And they had this passion that we must be part of this process. And even in the forming of the Constitution, there were 17 women members, all of which was extraordinary for that time, because people like in the UK, and of course USA, and of course you know that even Switzerland, it's only recently that the women have got a vote. But at that point, early 20th century, the women had already organized themselves, and they, Sarojini Naidu being another one, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, they all were passionate for this process. Now, the other thing I would like to mention is that at the height of the, before this happened, my family, young family, my mother and my young sisters, were stuck in Delhi, and my father went with the famous Rao to Ireland, because the Irish were also very keen on helping us to evolve this document, Eminent de Valera. And one of the people he met, my father and this group of people who went to the USA, was none other than a senator called Lyndon Johnson, who survived, as you know. So it's not as though that this document was done in isolation by just a few people. It was something that the world was watching. And even though that we associate the names of Ambedkar and Rajendra Prasad with the actual formation of it, behind there was also Mahatma Gandhi. And that's why it is a document that represents, I think, humanity's wish to create something for all times, not just for India. Because I think people also realize that as Indians, we were this huge, we call ourselves a subcontinent, but I think it's a civilization. And to me, the Constitution of India, the framing of it, represents the hope of an entire civilization. So I'm delighted that you are have this process, and I hope that the younger generation will carry it forwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I mean, just to speak a little bit more about K.V. Padmanabhan and the incredible role of the Assembly, Constituent Assembly Secretariat, they were in charge of creating the first electoral rolls at a scale that hadn't been attempted anywhere before. And one from reading Ornitsani's book that I found out was Mr. Padmanabhan was the reason why voting rights aren't tied to residence, because he recognized that there was a lot of movement within the country, especially because of partition, and that if we did tie residence rules to voting, then so many people would lose out on their franchise. There's also another small quip where Assam then as now was the hotbed of citizenship questions, and the district collector had put in like a small fee that everyone had to pay to get the voting form. It was 2 annas or something. I can't remember the exact amount. So Assam Citizens Union actually wrote to the Secretariat saying this will disenfranchise us. So the Secretariat wrote back to the district collector saying this is completely unconstitutional and you must remove the fee and allow everyone to sort of allow everyone to fill in this form and be able to vote in the election. So just the tremendous amount of work that went into the constitution, but also operationalizing democracy as we take for granted today, and so many people like K.V. Padmanabhan are responsible for that. Thank you. One of the things that I wanted to also discuss was the enduring legacy of the Indian Constitution, and Mr. Ramachandran already touched about it a little bit. I always reflect on the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan. So 1947, 2 nations are born, but also 2 Constituent Assemblies are formed. And the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan starts off in a very similar way. Jinnah gives this speech, which is really similar to the Objectives Resolution speech that Nehru gives, right? Talks about all citizens being equal. We must not be different communities. We must not be different castes and creed. He has Jogendranath Mandal, who is Ambedkar's peer and mentor, as his law minister. Another very famous Dalit leader who's thinking of emancipation not just from a foreign power, but also emancipation from internal structures of oppression. Right? And Jogendranath Mandal is incredible in his work. But then pretty soon the Assembly of Pakistan takes a very different route, and takes them 25 years, 3 constituent assemblies, and a very contentious relationship with their own constitution. So I always think of it like, sliding doors. You can go this way or that, and this is one of those rare instances where you can see 2 assemblies that started off in the same way but ended up with very different endpoints, so we say. And so while people may argue there are dents and hits that the Constitution of India has taken, by and large, I think the values that the assembly members put in there have survived. And so Manu, I will turn to you to get your views on why do you think that is? Why has the legacy of the Indian Constituent Assembly endured?
Well, thank you, Shruti, and very good afternoon, evening to everyone. Shruti, you assumed that I didn't have any link to the Constituent Assembly, and I wasn't going to actually share this until the next event I'm going to, but I actually have shared a panel with somebody who knows KC Reddy, KV Padmanabhan, and R.Reddy Krishnasamy. So that's my link to the Constituent Assembly.
You scared me there, Manu, and I frantically looked at Aswin saying, did we miss something here?
And I strongly urge everybody in the audience to use this line as well in future. But no, thank you. In all seriousness, thank you all for sharing such wonderful, lively, human anecdotes. Sometimes when we read the Constituent Assembly, even as lawyers, or maybe, younger lawyers, we face such great difficulty in making sense of it. So when there's so much personality, humaneness, so much character, sir, I think, if the person who was aghast that they were 12 minutes late was here today, he or she would be so proud, because Aswin and Shruti have, brought us here on time, in fact, ahead of time. So you've truly kept the... You've truly kept the spirit of the Constituent Assembly live, and thank you also to the Indian Society for University Dialogue and the Equals Project for putting together this wonderful event and the film screening before that. Also, thank you to everyone for coming here on a Saturday afternoon. I see very distinguished lawyers, Nalini Chidambaram, so Om Prakash, senior advocates, and Mr. Arun Natarajan. So thank you all, and it's great to see a lot of younger people too. I'll get straight away to Shruti's question, which is to do with the enduring legacy, as you called it, right? The simple answer, Shruti, is that because we are all such wonderful generations of Indians, we have this great constitution. But what I find is, and partly Mr. Raju Ramachandran, senior advocate, has alluded to this, is that the constitution has just enough flexibility, but also built in a lot of rigidity. Not rigidity, consistency, right? And I'll try to explain that very, very quickly. If you think about the word socialist, you all know, most of you would know, that the word socialist was included in the preamble in 1977 by virtue of the 42nd Amendment. Right? But during the debates of the Constituent Assembly, at least on 2 occasions, 2 different people tried to bring the word socialist into the preamble and even into the first article. These were Bajeshwar Prasad and K.T. Shah. On both occasions, it was rejected by the Assembly, and Dr. Ambedkar, speaking for the Constitution Drafting Committee, rejects it. But he says, look, we can't tell the people, the future generations of this country, what sort of political organization you should be. And he specifically meant, not that he didn't agree with the concept of socialism or he was capitalist or any such thing, but he did not want to prescribe a model, right, that would bind future generations. In fact, in the speech on 25th November 1949, which is his closing address to the Constituent Assembly, he specifically says, each generation will have to decide for itself what sort of a constitution, what sort of a society that they want. And therefore, I think, that level of flexibility has been brought in. And as Raju Ramachandran, Senior Advocate, has rightly pointed out, we did have, I think, around in the mid-70s, early 80s, a lot of judicial churning around the scope of the Constitution. And as a result of which, as many of you know, was the concept of the basic structure doctrine which was formed. Therefore, providing some level of consistency, right? So concepts or principles such as democracy, secularism, federalism are part of the basic structure and can never be changed. But that does not necessarily apply to other aspects such as socialism. And what's interesting about this is that the word federalism or federal is nowhere to be found in the Constitution, yet has survived as a principle and as almost as a doctrine that binds this country. So again, it's the level of flexibility that is there, but really, as Dr. Ambedkar says on 25th November 1949, it's up to the future generations to ensure that the Constitution, according to you, endures, right? And which is what it has done. So really, we can all, I think, take great credit for it. And my last pot shot is this, that, there's a lot of talk about the need for a new Constitution. We are 75 years old. Times have changed, sure. There's new generations, there's millennials. They're apparently extremely on time and very punctual. But nevertheless, there is this very compelling argument that Constitution is also outdated and not in line with our, what they call Indian values, which again, I strongly protest against, but nevertheless, that might be the start of another debate I don't want to get into. But what I'm trying to say is, I think we ourselves haven't yet quite fulfilled the promise that the Constitution gives, and I think I'm just glad to be here amongst such wonderful luminaries and people with a lot of excitement and young at heart enthusiasm. So thank you for the opportunity.
And I will go next to Mr. Raju Ramachandran, because I just this morning read an article that you had written a few years ago about how the flexibility of the Constitution is its greatest strength. So I'll ask you to reflect on Manu's point. But one interesting anecdote from the Assembly is they're sort of putting restrictions on the fundamental rights. And this member from Bihar says, if the people want a revolution, let them have a revolution. Who are we to stop it, right? Yeah. So in a way, the revolutionary nature that some members of the Assembly expected from the Indian public hasn't quite come to fruition yet. But Mr. Ramachandran, I will let you speak a little bit on what you see as the greatest strength of the Constitution.
I only wish you hadn't called upon me immediately after Manu, because Jawaharlal Nehru, after Zamindari abolition acts were struck down by the high courts of Allahabad and Patna, complained, lawyers have purloined the Constitution, they have stolen the Constitution. So one lawyer after another, this audience shouldn't feel lawyers have stolen this discussion. But I wish to make 2 quick points. One, when we are talking of the enduring legacy of the Constitution, we must not forget one important fact, that the constitution making process was so meticulously documented. That's a point which Granville Auster also makes, both in terms of the debates being recorded, the constitutional documents being collected and published, and B. Shivarao, apart from B.N. Rao's contribution, B. Shivarao has played an important role in the preservation of this constitutional history. And why this is important is that we fully understand the context in which this constitution has been made. If this meticulous record keeping had not been there, judges, according to their ideologies or whims or fancies, could have interpreted it out of existence. But there was an original intent to which you can hark back. The spirit of the constitution, how it was made, all that is documented. And so that's something very important when we are talking about the enduring nature of the constitution, because we lawyers know only too well how by interpretation this can become that. So that is one point I want to make. The other point is something which Manu touched upon also, about generations. Now, Justice H.R. Khanna, the revered Justice H.R. Khanna, who spoke up for personal liberty in the ADM Jabalpur case, it was his judgment which tilted the balance in the Keshavananda Bharti case. And if the basic structure doctrine exists, it is because Justice H.R. Khanna tilted the balance. His reasoning was different. But you have a basic structure doctrine because now a majority of 7 judges out of 13, as against 6, talks of basic structure. But even he said, no generation has a monopoly of wisdom. He says that in his judgment. So this relates to the flexibility of the constitution, or what Dr. Ambedkar said, no, let's not put this word socialism. You're putting in a doctrine, a political doctrine, an economic doctrine. No, you can't bind generations down with what we think is appropriate. And so it is because our constitution, while being rigid in certain ways, is also flexible in so many other ways. We are now talking of the 129th Amendment. It is this balance which the Constitution amendment process itself contemplates, which ensures that the Constitution endures.
Indeed. Thank you. And suitably chastised, I will turn to a non-lawyer on the panel. Ambassador Latha Reddy, I think I'm particularly curious to hear from you because you have dealt with the Indian Constitution from a different lens, not a legal lens, but from diplomacy and the foreign service lens. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you saw as the enduring legacy of the Constituent Assembly and the Constitution.
I think basically, the Constitution of India for me is really a object of worship. As I said, because of the atmosphere I grew up in, because of my uncle, because of my grandfather and so on, I was taught to cherish the Constitution. And also, I must, in the interests of full confession, I must tell you that I'm a member of the Constituent Conduct Group, Constitutional Conduct Group, which is a group of retired civil servants who essentially raise issues where they see the Constitution as being violated. And we actually write letters to the Prime Minister, to the Chief Ministers, and we see ourselves as an apolitical body. We are not espousing the cause of any one party. We basically say that this is in violation of the Constitution. That is really the way to go. The second thing I'd like to point out is something that's very self-evident. The very fact that our Constitution has lasted for 75 years is its lasting legacy, with all the amendments. The fact is that, look at the neighborhood. No other country, and I've been in Thailand where they've had 17 constitutions, and it's ridiculous, and every time there's a new government or there's a military coup, there's a new constitution. So I think the fact of the matter is the enduring legacy is the longevity of the Constitution itself. And I think that is something we don't perhaps pay enough attention to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Before I take it to Geeta Doctor, I'm going to add a question for you. I think, we've all been very happy and kind to the Constitution. But I wanted to also add a slightly critical question to your answer. So we saw parts of Ambedkar's speech as the Assembly adopts the Constitution, where he says, we're entering a life of contradictions. How long can this continue? And I don't think he would have imagined this contradiction would have continued for 75 years, right? His idea was there would be a revolution from those at the bottom. So while the Constitution has definitely endured, I think we can agree that a lot of its ideals haven't, in terms of equality, justice. We think about the Uniform Civil Code, things like the right to marry that were discussed in the Fundamental Rights Subcommittee, which haven't materialized, even though the Constitution and the constitutional values are lauded by courts and people like us. So I'm curious to hear from all of you, but starting with Mrs. Geeta Doctor, how do you make sense of a constitution that is wonderful and egalitarian, and the reality of a country that holds within it much inequality, much injustice? And what is the use of a constitution if it doesn't change the country?
Thank you for that question, because I think this is something that we should all address. And I have also to confess that there was a point at which I was a very close associate of Minu Masani at a time, and I was also the editor of this liberal paper, Freedom First. And we were quite passionately against the government. But you see, being against the government does not necessarily mean that we are against the Constitution. And any document, I think I agree that it is to be respected, but everything has also to evolve, and it cannot be fossilized, and we should not make it into a kind of, because one of the basic ideas that were discussed was, what kind of constitution do you want? Do you want it a theocratic, that we worship it, or do we want it for the people? Now, as we have chosen we the people should also be in a position to maybe define their new perceptions. It should not be stuck in some vault of ideas. So I think this idea that it should evolve is very important to me. And anyone who read the Hindu today will know that one of the first people to attack it or to question it was the A.K. Gopalan case. Freedom of speech. Now the thing is, for people of my generation, freedom of speech is basic to what we think of as our responsibility of citizens. But as you grow older, you also realize that it should not affect other people's freedoms. So this constitution and the document tries to balance these features. It doesn't say that this is the only way. We have to choose different ways because, as I said, India is not just one monolithic being. It's a whole process. And so I think that the Constitution reflects that. And I'm so grateful that there are people who will defend the parameters. But it does not mean that it should be a document on which you hit people's freedoms. That is my view. I will, of course, pass it to the prima donnas.
This is what is called a self-goal.
Would you like to go ahead? Yeah.
Two reactions to what you said. One, the Constitution is a statement of purpose of what the state is all about. So when you are talking about the unfortunate reality of large sections of the population not having realized the constitutional promise, I think that's what you meant. Let's remember, to use a popular phrase in political discourse today, the Constitution was never intended to be a remedy. That you create the Constitution and poverty goes. No, it's not that. But it is the statement of a grand purpose towards which we have striven and will continue to strive. Second, I can't help myself from telling an irreverent story, but this is about one of the most distinguished residents of this great city at one time, and what a city this is, Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. And the only exculpatory factor I have before being irreverent is that this is authentic, because this story is recorded in a biography of Dr. Radhakrishnan by his son, the eminent historian Dr. S. Gopal. And so nothing can be truer than what is stated there, and it's a clinically honest biography of a father by a son. Now, Dr. Radhakrishnan was human like all of us, and of course, he was a thinker, he was a statesman, he was a philosopher, but he also strayed in his personal life. And so apparently, he gave a talk on the need for fidelity in marriage to an audience when a particular lady with whom he is believed to have been having a liaison at that time was very much a member of that audience. And he was asked, Dr. Radhakrishnan was asked, aren't you being a hypocrite? Here you are, this liaison is a known fact, and you're talking of fidelity in marriage. To which Radhakrishnan is supposed to have replied with a straight face and very seriously, the fact that I have strayed from an ideal doesn't mean that the ideal doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that I shouldn't hold up that ideal. So to bring this down to our present context, the fact that we haven't realized a particular promise doesn't mean that we shouldn't stay the course and make sure that the promise is realized.
Ambassador Latha, Reddy, would you have anything to add here?
Yes, I agree that the fact that you have an ideal, doesn't mean that, you sort of abandon the ideal because you're not able to live up to it. And I think that as far as the Constitution is concerned, this is exactly what we try to do in the Constitutional Group, for instance. When we talk about, I seem to be doing something wrong, okay. When we talk about, the fact that we see the Constitution being violated, I think you have to protest, and even if we ourselves may not be complete models of rectitude or otherwise, and we may not have exactly followed the provisions of the Constitution in our own individual careers, it doesn't take away from us the right to protest when we see those ideals being violated. So I would agree with the distinguished gentleman that yes, we need not necessarily live up to an ideal, but we can defend that ideal. Thank you.
Manu, before you answer, I'm going to tack on another question to you because I want to be, since everybody's lauded our timekeeping, I feel we have to end on time. So I'm going to tack one last question to you. One thing that, when we work at the Equals Project, we really believe is that the Assembly gives us a model on how to work with people in public life that we dissent with, right? I think Samvidhaan does a really good job of showing the really different ideas of India that were discussed in the Assembly. I mean, when I went to school, like the history book was all, we got independence on 15th August 1947, and then we all lived happily ever after, right? Which is absolutely not the case. People in the Assembly had very, very different views on what this new Indian nation would be. And someone like Hasrat Mohani refused to sign the constitution. He said, this is a fraud on the states, I won't sign it. So I think it's a really good model for how dissent in public life can work. And Manu, I'm going to ask you specifically because I often see you dissenting on panels and, in contentious situations. So in addition to answering the previous question, I think it would also be useful to reflect on what lessons on dissent we can take from the Constituent Assembly.
The primary difference between the dissent that was expressed during the Constituent Assembly debates and today is that you didn't back then have the enforcement directorate turning up at your house. But that aside, no, let me actually, I'll answer that with some seriousness. I'm sorry for that joke, but I'll go back to what you were talking about with regard to the contradictions that Dr. Ambedkar foretold us that we were entering into, right? The context of that particular statement, he said, we are going to enter into this sort of great, spectrum of contradictions because he felt on one hand, the Constitution gave everyone here political equality. Everybody had one vote. We all each had one sort of voice. The Constitution in Article 14, declares the individual, some cases person, some cases citizen, as one unit of a right seeker. But whereas he was very much aware that socially and economically there were grave inequalities, that people were split. And he says, in the same speech, he says, you're deluding yourself if you call this a nation. He says, how can you be a nation when you are split into thousands of castes, right? So he was very much adopting a pragmatic view, telling people, look, we've done this great job, don't get us wrong. He starts by saying how many hours and days they spent, but then he ends up saying, look, there's a real challenge up ahead. And he specifically says, as if to people who are reading 75 years later, he said, you can't blame the British anymore. Now this is our constitution, so you have to work with it. But ultimately, how that sort of speech concludes is very interesting. What I found fascinating is he said, look, constitution is only a document. It has fantastic words. Lawyers love playing with words. As Sir said, this can be that or can be and. We know that. But he says, ultimately, it's up to the people, how they deal with the Constitution, right? So the people who have this power from the Constitution flowing from the different statutes to choose people whom they want to govern themselves. People how they respond when constitutional rights are being infringed, when there are infractions across, society as we see it. How do people respond to it? That really, he says, is what it comes down to, right? And I think that's a very interesting sort of take on it. Now, what you sort of also, made life difficult for us is to say, how do we have this sort of public discourse and not, end up punching each other or, doing any serious injury to one another? I think it is very much happening. The 2024 election is a perfect example of it. This entire state dissented with the rest of the country, right? This one state, there was no elected Bharatiya Janata Party member of parliament. That is, so politics, election is still keeping discourse alive. Of course, I want to sort of specifically mention something which is in the news last week when the Congress leader Rahul Gandhi said that I am now fighting the Indian state itself, right? Yeah. And everybody went up in arms. How can he say that he's against the state? He's an anti-national and so on. Not knowing that Ambedkar would have laughed, saying this is not even a nation, so divided. But nevertheless, the fact is the Indian state today consists of the government, partly the judiciary, the media, civil society organizations, and all of us, right? So what Rahul Gandhi, according to me, was trying to say, and I'm not his spokesperson, nor do I claim to have read his mind, but I think he's trying to tell us that, look, the entire state has been tilted, captured, and it is now, for us, people who want to dissent, who want to disagree with what is happening to the Constitution, what is happening with the abrogation of Article 370 or the Citizenship Amendment Act or any one of the 100 changes that has been brought in, and how do we sort of dissent? I think really that is the real test for us as we go forward. How do we, as you rightly put, how do we dissent? How do we disagree without, shredding our democratic fabric? So that, honestly, I do not have the answer to that, and I would love to hear what the others have to say.
Anybody want to take, I want to give someone the mic for the last thought on this before we open up to audience questions.
I think the question is, how do we take up, how do we dissent, right? I think by speaking up, I think, again, I'm sorry to again come back to the Constitutional Conduct Group, but that's what we do, we dissent. We point out what's wrong with the approach and we say, this is what we think should be done, and I think every citizen of India has the right to dissent and to point out when they feel the Constitution is being violated. So, and when we don't exercise that right, I think we do a great disservice to our nation.
Thank you. I mean, since I write so much about art, I feel that what is happening today with the Hussein situation, I will not call it a problem. I think that because artists and writers and theater people are all dissenting in a creative manner. You see, dissent doesn't mean that we shout at the parliament or, write angry letters. We have to be creative in our dissent. And I think it is really shocking that the Delhi Art Gallery has been forced to remove 2 paintings of Hussein, which, and now he's dead and gone, of course, that he did about 20 years back, saying that for one person, this is an insult to Hinduism. Now, I do not think that Hinduism is so feeble that 2 paintings is going to destroy the Hindu idea at all. So, why is it that we do not then stand up for those 2 paintings? It's not that I'm particularly fond of the paintings, but I think that every artist and every creative person has a right to make what you call a dissent. Disagreement with the, it doesn't have to be the Constitution. So I would urge everyone to think of creative ways of bringing about this dissent. It's not enough to be angry or upset, because that's not going to work.
I'm sorry if I'm taking up more time than you had budgeted, but I'm tempted to say this because Geeta ji has spoken about art. And since I am a music buff, my personal hero, Harry Belafonte, had his hero, who was Paul Robeson, the great black singer, an American communist, who suffered during the McCarthy eras. He said 2 very significant things. He said, artists are the gatekeepers of the truth. And second, that artists are the radical voice of civilization. And that is the duty of art, to dissent, not to conform. So freedom of expression in art means that.
You're right. Yeah. What I'm hearing is dissent is duty, whether that dissent is creative, political, bureaucratic, dissent is duty. So with that, I will open up to audience questions. Because we are low on time, what I will do is I will take 3 at a time. If there are 3 people brave enough to ask questions, I can already see one person there.
Discourse went into this question, but then I want to ask is anyway. Integrity of the Constitution, as in the integral portion of the Constitution, is protected as a basic structure of the Constitution. And parallelly, you spoke about the rigidity and the flexibility. I want to ask, like, how imperative is judicial activism in protecting the basic structure of the Constitution? Because our Constitution did not think of parliamentary sovereignty as something that is there in UK. So, yeah, I just wanted to ask this question.
Judicial activism. Anybody else with a question? Then we can take them at one shot. Okay. While we wait for another question, I will turn to Mr. Raju Ramachandran to talk about judicial, or to get us started about judicial activism.
Yeah, this is obviously a lawyer's question. And as the more senile among the two of the lawyers here, I'll take it. Now, I think in the context in which you are using the word judicial activism, that's really a misnomer. You use the phrase judicial activism where judges tread on territory which are traditionally seen to be that of the executive, because the judges are filling up gaps in the law. There's judicial activism in environmental matters, for instance. In adoption matters, guidelines are laid down. All that is activism. But in the context of your question, this is not activism. This is the job for which judges are paid for. We are paying the judges for that. There's a fundamental rights chapter. It's their job to enforce fundamental rights. So it's not judicial activism. Judges have to rise to the occasion. Judges have to do their duty, as civil servants have to do their duty, as legislators have to do their duty. That's all there is to it.
Thank you. Manu, anything you would like to add to that?
So in all fairness, I should have taken that question, answer that question, because I have less to lose. I'm a much insignificant lawyer compared to you. Just to make sure, before we answer the question, is there any judges of the Madras High Court or anybody sitting next to one, please let us know. I think the other way to look at it, the converse way to look at it, is judicial abdication, right? To put it differently to what Sir has said. We've seen either judicial overreach, where they go way beyond their remit, or they're abdicating. Just see the number of cases, constitutional or otherwise, which have taken 3 years, 4 years, 5 years to decide. We had one judgment in the electoral bonds case last year. The challenge was in, I think, 2017 or early 18. We have the Article 370 abrogation case decided last year. The challenge was pending from 2018, if I'm not mistaken. So they're taking 5 years, 4 years, 6 years to decide constitutional matters of grave importance. Contrast that with the British Parliament. When the Parliament was prorogued improperly, it took them 3 months to reach the highest court of the land. Things are being let to a situation where they become, as lawyers would call it, infructuous, right, before the judges step in. I think that is a grave problem. Secondly, there are cases where of great personal liberty at stake, bail cases. There are people who I can name who've been in jail for years, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, for what, right? I mean, just going against the own Supreme Court jurisprudence that bail is the rule, jail is the exception. So there is no activism, as Sir said. giving adjournments. And I think not because I practice here, but the Madras High Court is reasonably good. Let me just put that on record in case there is a judge watching this later. There are cases in the Allahabad and other high courts where bail cases have been heard over 10, 12 adjournments, right? So lot of what I would say, what we need to be really concerned about is abdication. Make sure that cases are heard on time, cases are not pushed beyond, when the matter at stake is immediate, urgent, or fairly straightforward.
Thank you. We'll take those two questions together. Is that Mami at the end? Yes. Okay, we'll go there to Mami first, and then to the gentleman in the third row. Yeah. Okay.
Please come. Thank you for coming, ma'am.
Well, to be fair, his name is Swaroop. We just had multiple Swaroops when I was in law school, so he got the name Mami. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I remind people of an old aunt or something, but no, just a quick question. The Constituent Assembly was overwhelmingly Hindu, overwhelmingly upper caste. Just to anyone on the panel, do you think that reflects in the Constitution itself? And do you think these last 75 years, there have been, through these 129 amendments, have there been any pushbacks against that, the original composition of the Constituent Assembly and the biases that they may have?
So, ma'am, my question is regarding fraternity as a concept. We talk about equality, justice, liberty, all those things, but then we lack a discussion on fraternity. Me, as a person in this society, I could find the concept of oneness with the other person, oneness with the country. That is lacking very much. Is there any suggestions that the respected panelists could give for us to improve that situation? Thank you, sir.
So I think the question was fraternity as an underexplored concept or value within the Indian Constitution, and how can we look at it more closely? How can we promote fraternity within the Indian polity? Fraternity, yeah. So I will start with the question on representation. I think Mr. Ramachandran, you had earlier also spoken about representation and indirect election into the assembly. So we'll start with that question, but then I will hand it off to anyone in the panel to answer either of them.
I made this point in the beginning that it was not a representative body in that sense, though it embodied a wide cross-section of opinion. And therefore, yes, you are right. The upper caste and the more privileged would have dominated in terms of composition, but nevertheless, one can see empathy. But perhaps you are right that real life experience was not, many of the members wouldn't have had the life experience which subsequent members of parliament would have had, and therefore what was an ideal at that time, the realization of the ideal comes about gradually as society progresses and as more representative parliaments have come into being. I think you make a good point there, that therefore this is, I wouldn't call it a pushback, but I would call it a carrying forward of what was set out as a mere ideal.
So, on the first question, I have two things to say, and then also on the second question. The first question, you're right, but it was also not representative of gender at that point of time, right? So there's many such inconsistencies in that sense. But really, I think it is the involvement or the guidance of, say, Dr. Ambedkar, because he speaks more than anybody else, right? And really it sort of, maybe gives it a bit more balance in that sense. Now, the only point I want to make here is the very first amendment to the Constitution was on caste-based reservation for the backward castes, right? So again, it perhaps nuances your question, and to say that, and therein, lies the fact, or lies the wisdom of the Constituent Assembly. Like, they gave it enough flexibility that even within a year and a half, there was a amendment to the Constitution, and the Constitution could take it and could get along with it, right? And as Sir pointed out, there's 129 such amendments now. So it's still got that flexibility, and knowing very well, as we both mentioned earlier, Ambedkar's words saying that future generations will decide what is best. This is just a vision document for the country as we see it today, standing here on 1949/1950. Sorry, what is the second question?
Fraternity.
Oh, fraternity. Can I just make one point and then pass it on to the people who are better versed to answer this? So I go back to Ambedkar and Periyar in 1924-25. Both of them actually in consecutive years make the same point. They say India's greatest challenges are, at that point, they say interdining and intermarriage. Interdining and intermarriage, right? So they talk about the intercaste marriage. Now, according to the national survey, do you know, as of the last survey was unfortunately done in 2007-8, the intercaste proportion of marriages done across the country is less than 7%. Interreligious is around 8-9%. Now, this is almost 80 to 100 years after Ambedkar and Periyar spoke about this. You use the word fraternity. I'm using the word intercaste, but essentially that's what also Ambedkar discusses when he speaks on 25th November 1949. So that is pretty much, according to me, a social problem for which the Constitution cannot be the solution. It has to come from political or social movements to address that.
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with you that yes, it has to come in an organic fashion, in an evolved fashion, if you like. Fraternity cannot be forced. And on the first question, that was on representative, yes. I'd just like to point out, but there were people like my grandfather and my uncle in the Constituent Assembly who fought all their life against the prejudice against backward classes, because mind you, in Bangalore, in Mysore state rather at that time, our family was considered a somewhat backward class. And therefore to say that it was a wholly upper caste and wholly, sort of, how shall I put it, in a very elitist framework is not entirely correct. There were people drawn from all sections of society. There were people from minorities as well, a large proportion of them. And it's just a pity that in today's parliaments don't reflect that width of vision that perhaps what the makers of the Constitution did.
Well, on the subject of fraternity, I won't say that the Constitution had the idea, but I would like to say on the subject of homosexuality, which has been a very, very contentious question amongst religious bodies and maybe even society, but Parliament was able to bring about this change. And it is very remarkable for us in India, with all our spectrum of behavior. And I think it's made a difference because yesterday you might have seen in Thailand, they're allowing same-sex marriages. So these are things that evolve in society. You cannot expect something that was done 75 years ago to also address questions like fraternity, if you like, or homosexuality, if you're more specific.
Thank you. I think the message is that the legacy continues to be carried forward and carried forward by people like us, a legacy that we are very honored to have. With that, I think I want to thank this panel for straddling the personal and the political really well. A wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. And I will hand over to Aswin for a more formal vote of thanks.
Thank you for inviting us to this exciting group.
Well, I'd say I'm no Shyam Benegal to condense this conversation that took place, but I'm not going to even attempt to do it. But more importantly, I think before I go into thanking everyone, I think it's a pat on the back between me and Shruti because we were able to pull this off. Because we never thought that we'll be able to track down people who are linked to the Constituent Assembly to share personal anecdotes, and thank God we're getting it recorded, so it's there for posterity. And so on that note, coming to the vote of thanks, yes, I'd begin by thanking all our speakers who eagerly accepted our invitation to speak today. Mr. Ramachandran, who flew all the way from Delhi despite his busy schedule, and I'd like to thank Mr. Rana Mukherjee, who got us in touch with him. Ambassador Latha Reddy, who in such short notice flew down from Bangalore, and Professor Vijay Chandru, who immediately got in touch with her and convinced her to do so. Mrs. Geeta Doctor, who despite her age and health came to share some of her father's anecdotes, and Mr. Manuraj Shanmugasundaram, who I had the pleasure of designating senior. I am more than glad that he was able to make it. I'm pretty sure he had to probably reschedule some important arbitration hearing today to make it to our conversation. We'd also like to thank Senior Advocate Om Prakash sir, who has been the patron of our organization and supported today's conversation. I'd like to thank the Alliance Française of Madras, Patricia, who made it finally from the back, and he's taking a video of me. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving us the space for having conversations of this sort. I'm pretty. We as students feel more freer to talk about contemporary ideas in an open environment. And the AFM has been a constant pillar of support. I'd like to thank the Tamil Nadu Dr. Ambedkar Law University, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor N.S. Santosh Kumar, the Registrar, Professor Ranjit Abraham, the Faculty Coordinator, for giving the Indian Society for Universal Dialogue a platform among the students of the School of Excellence in Law to strive to have conversations of this sort. I'd like to thank Shruti, with whom we collaborated today, and as an excellent moderator. I'm pretty sure there's nobody else who can do this job of moderating among stalwarts. And thank each and every one of you for making it today. And I hope you have taken with you a part of the Constitution, because at the end of the day, at the stroke of the midnight hour tonight, we'll be completing 75 years of the Constitution, getting into the 76th year, and look forward to seeing you for another event soon. Thank you so much.
And I want to take a moment to thank Aswin, who pulled everything off, so a huge round of applause for Aswin.